Hello and welcome to the Brooklyn Rail's 1316th New Social Environment. I'm Joshua, a Programs Associate here at the Rail, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Asher Liftin and Jason Rosenfeld. And now I'll introduce today's guest and host. Asher Liftin is an artist concerned with the mediation inherent in painted images and with the mediation that occurs when we observe the outside world. His paintings embrace photography for its semblance of objective perception and unravel into meticulously hand-painted fields of dots and lines. He received a BA in visual art and a BS in cognitive science from Yale University in 2021. Our host today, Distinguished Chair and Professor of Art History at Marymount Manhattan College, Jason Rosenfeld, has curated the exhibitions John Everett Millais, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian Avant-Garde, and River Crossings. He is a co-author of the monograph Cecily Brown and a senior writer and editor at large for the Brooklyn Rail. And with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, Joshua. Welcome, Asher.
Thank you so much.
Great to have you here today. Just take a little care of business. I want to thank Joshua and Magali and Chloe at the Rail for helping to set all this up. And I want to thank Caroline Scarcliffe at Nino Mier, who was essential in getting me imagery and other kinds of information. I think she's off this week. I don't know where she is. But grateful to the gallery for all their help with getting this stuff together. This is New Social Environment number 1316, believe it or not. In 1316, Duccio was working in Siena. He had another couple years to go in his labors. And 1316, I think that's how many people were involved in Bad Bunny's routine on Sunday at the Super Bowl, which of course brought meaning back to life. But we're going to continue that trend with Asher today and talk about his work and his new show at Nino Mier. He's coming at you live from his apparently uninsulated Bed-Stuy studio. Maybe this show will go a little ways to him being able to get some insulation and be a little warmer. But it is a tradition, of artists being in very cold studios and sort of suffering. Delacroix moaned about that. He moaned about a lot of things, but Delacroix always was moaning about how cold the studio was, and they had they always have like a furnace, like a wood burning stove in the middle of the studio. Ensor paints wonderful images of himself like as a skeleton suffering in his freezing studio. Welcome also to Slate, who's joining the Zoom per usual, the house cat. I'm going to share the imagery and we can start talking about Asher's amazing show. Hopefully everyone can see this. There we are. Follow him on Instagram. His name is his address. And here is the gallery. So Nino Mier, this is Nino Mier, not on Crosby, but on in Tribeca at 380 Broadway, downtown. The show is up only through February 14th. Valentine's Day. So take your loved one down there to see Asher's exhibition, which is in the single room of the space, and it occupies the two lateral walls. Here's a view looking into the gallery here. The title is Cat's Cradle. Here's a view. I had them turn the lights out. I like looking at it with the lights out. When I was doing a project on Cecily Brown, I learned that her biological father, David Sylvester, the great British critic and writer, famous for working on de Kooning and other artists, liked to go into galleries and ask them to turn the lights out because he wanted to see what things looked like under natural light. So there you go. This is my own photo, and here's a view of the interior looking towards the street. We are going to talk about what's going on in these pictures, but I want to talk a little bit first with Asher about his background and what his story is and where he comes from, to educate you all a little bit. He was born in 1998, lives and works in Brooklyn now, but you went to Yale undergrad, right? Not the grad school for art. And undergrad, you studied what at Yale?
I studied art and cognitive science.
Art and cognitive science. So what was the goal with cognitive science, getting a BS in cognitive science initially?
Um, well, and part of it is, Yale is a very liberal arts school, but cognitive science is also extremely liberal arts heavy in that it's interdisciplinary, and so it brings together. It's you're essentially trying to figure out how the brain works and how we think, and rather than do that through neuroscience or through psychology, it's kind of bringing together parts of neuroscience, parts of psychology, parts of computer science,
Mhm.
parts of economics, and all these things to try to figure out this very multimodal process of seeing and thinking, and so what it was interesting to me about it was was the way that I mean, I came at it basically from art. I was always interested in math, but my interest.
Was that something that you excelled at St. Anne's? I know you went to St. Anne's private school in Brooklyn. Actually, that's where our former babysitter for my kids, Liza Patterson, went. I don't know if you two overlapped, but St. Anne's, very progressive education, broad kind of approach to learning. And is that where you first got interested in both math and the arts?
Yeah, I mean, sir, I mean, I would say not where I first got interested in the arts. I wound up there because of an interest in the arts,
Mm.
but I went to before that I went to Hunter, which is much more, I would say, technical and math heavy rather than art heavy. And I
Hunter on
like,
the Upper East Side, right?
yeah, yeah, exactly. Um and I was playing chess, and so I was interested in kind of these more math ways of thinking, but Sands is not known for its math rigor, and so I was definitely had an interest while I was there, but the art was really kind of the foreground of my passion.
Hmm. And then at Yale, you're taking classes in both areas in visual art and
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I wasn't sure I was gonna, have a career as an artist. And so, but that's where my real interest always lay. And and then cognitive science was actually, I mean, I almost got stuck when I was painting, and I felt like many of the paintings I was making, I would create and then feel kind of excited about, and then come back to a week later, and it's sort of like the air had come out of it, and so I sort of hit a wall, and the thing that my solution to that was going more into cognitive science and looking at the process of seeing and building meaning from sensory inputs, um, and then and then eventually kind of through an interest in that, finding correlations in new processes for approaching painting that would mirror those that would structurally mirror these mental processes. And then once I did that, it felt like a lot of things started to open up to me, and that I kind of had this more exciting engagement with the paintings I was working on.
were there any teachers at Yale in the arts field that particularly influenced you or inspired you?
Yeah, I mean, my first ever art class there was with Robert Storr, who I know has been on the rail, and he sort of, pushed me to throw everything that I thought about painting out the window. And I had a Russian art teacher that was, much more traditional, named Katya Arnold at St. Anne's, who was terribly disappointed with me early on at Yale because I was making, very geometric um, and kind of pared down spatial
Mhm.
relationships on canvases that were more like visual puzzles and ways of breaking down everything that I thought that I kind of ingested about painting up until that point.
So
Um,
as an undergrad, do you have access to grad school classes or what's going on
well, you can
in the
crash. I mean, you can basically you can crash. I would crash the crits. I mean, everything is pretty open, so you can
Okay.
you can, I after graduating, I lived in New Haven for a few years
Yeah.
on my own, and a lot of the people, basically everyone I knew there were other students that were in the MFA program who I had met and kind of visited their studios and hung around when they were in the program. And so
Yeah.
there's a lot of crossover,
Okay.
I would say.
And like works like these, which I've found from 2019, I mean, do these relate to what you're talking about, this sort of inceptive works that you're trying to figure out a kind of psychological end process
Yeah, I mean, I think that
approach.
the two black and white images were small paintings that were both studies from from on the right, obviously there's Rembrandt, but and so I always had this interest in the history of painting and trying to find a way to create a sense of repetition without sort of just feeling indebted. And I think these two black and white paintings didn't quite get there for me, and
Yeah.
so I was sort of I was disappointed with still kind of almost having the nostalgia of loving these paintings and not being able to really compete in a way or engage with them in a way that would create some sort of new meaning rather than just kind of creating a postcard, version of the
Yeah.
painting.
But at the
The
same
ones,
time, it is a kind of breaking down of an existing image, which is, of course, you're experiencing it in reproduction, right? So you're not in front
totally,
of actual Rembrandt or what was it, Mary Magdalene on the left, some kind of image.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So, there is that kind of thought going in. And then the works at the bottom are a kind of layering. I know you're interested in sort of movement and roadways and transportation and these kinds of things, which we'll see. But also a kind of subversion of the postcard aesthetic in a way.
yeah. I mean, these two paintings were larger, and I was interested in the collage and taking photographs and also thinking about the actual way of rendering the photograph. So moving from
Right.
the photograph into a painted surface and the very saturated, heavily painted kind of pastorally, modern pastorally imagery has a different feel from these kind of highways inside that in person are very kind of thinly painted.
Yeah.
A lot of turpentine, so they're very matte and there's almost colorless and they're
Hmm.
cut out of these images. And so the surface itself, in terms of the thickness of the paint and the color, and these things change. And then the right hand panel, I was kind of interested in rhyming this, having this curve that comes from the
Yeah.
highway and into the edge of the pool. Um, and so it was sort of finding ways, finding interest maybe to move between a photographic image and give it kind of material weight and surface and properties that are inherent in painting.
Yeah, and it's sort of obviously play on illusionism and that interconnectedness of this image with this image in the way that Leonardo connects foreground and background in his pictures with sort of curving lines like in the Mona
Yeah.
Lisa. But also I want people to note the way that the cutouts here in the center are not geometrically resolved. We'll come back to that when we look at some of the more recent work. There's a kind of manipulation both of the image as a representation of a sorts. I want to put everything in quotes, but the representation itself, which seems to be kind of moving or is kind of twisted, is not resolved in a kind of horizontality and verticality, 90-degree angles. So just keep this all in mind. So Asher had a couple shows in a gallery, the Aisling Gallery at the Study in New Haven, which is the Yale Hotel there. Very comfortable, good views. I've been there many times. And then two shows at Alessandro Albanese in Milan, in Italy, which must be nice for young artists. And then in 2023, his first show of three so far at Nino Mier. So it's a bit of a leap, of course, but let's just talk for a minute or two about, or a couple minutes about the paintings in that show. Now, I was at the opening in 2023, and it was a great scene and the big space on Crosby Street. And the big first room was full of paintings like this, although not all on this grand scale. And then the back room had a number of drawings in it, as far as I remember. And, it was really striking to see these works and to think about what you're attempting. And he sort of just burst on the scene like Athena out of the head of Zeus with these large scale works. And I loved it because as a, you know, rigorous PhD art historian who's interested in historical pictures. It immediately kind of connected with me. So talk a little bit about this sort of weird David Bowie homage, The Devouring of Ziggy Stardust, the massive triptych. It's really three panels, but they're connected from 2023, and what has happened in the interim that's led to you to these kinds of pictures.
So this painting, I guess the material difference between this painting and the previous paintings that came out of that engagement with cognitive science was can't really see in the image here because it's so zoomed out, but the surface structure of the painting is based on the printer system, so the cyan, magenta. Yeah, there you go. So you can see it's like they're all dots and lines. And it uses the cyan, magenta, yellow, black, ink system that the printer uses to convert, a photographic image into a printed image. And they're painted with very thin ink layers that are translucent. And the way that
Medium, sorry, the medium is what? What kind of paint?
they're acrylic inks.
Okay.
And I water them down a lot. So the surface is, completely flat. And they can layer upon one another to create color. And so the way that the brain builds meaning is that you get all these bits of information from light, and then you kind of move through these layers of transparent processing to go from little dots to little lines, and then as you get more and more abstract, you get the silhouettes and the outlines of objects, and then weight and association and et cetera, until you get to very abstract relationships. And so I wanted this sort of layered sense of transparency, and bit like when you're up close to the paintings, they're essentially abstract. So then that led to the material structure of the paintings. This particular painting is not obviously photographic, but it comes from what was a very early, now it's almost like a bad word, but it's an early image generation AI program, and it was kind of one of the early stable diffusion models, and I was interested in kind of using this almost Baroque mannerist imagery that I would give it sentences and phrases to create figures from. That yeah, there you go. And because it's so early, if you do this now in the modern models, you get these very polished, almost cartoonish images that don't have much life in them. And so what was interesting to me was that the way that the program would screw up the figures gave them this mannerist energy and this intensity. And you have figures with three arms and contorted in a kind of a contrapposto that is impossible, or these sort of ideas that come from that it's sort of almost getting to, but then screwing up. And so that was interesting to me because it's art historical, but it doesn't actually. But it's a digital image in the same way that a photograph is. It's not. It doesn't exist in a material sense, and it has no knowledge of it ever having existed in a material sense. But also, the Baroque specifically was an interesting way to get there for me, because the Baroque seems to be this kind of, this sense of auteur kind of creating this very dramatic image, and it's sort of it's kind of the artist really asserting him or herself, often himself, but it comes out of this very kind of concerted effort in the Council of Trent to create images that pull a viewer in. And so there was this desire to, when people were burning paintings and icons, the church wanted to pull the viewer back in. And so it's actually the strategy behind it's almost propagandistic in terms of being designed with the human visual system in mind, to almost seduce a viewer. And so that almost artificiality that is inherent in the Baroque seemed like kind of an interesting place to create this new sort of this new artificial image.
Hmm.
And then so then and this is long-winded, but then Ziggy Stardust entered the equation because as I was typing in these, I mean, the programs won't do nudity, so I have to use terms like bathers or wrestlers or all these things to get
Yeah.
these nude bodies. And when I've always loved David Bowie, and so when I put in David Bowie at the devouring of Ziggy Stardust, he doesn't come into the picture, but he's basically dispersed throughout the whole. So you have these, figures with crazy red manes, and the
Wow.
reds and blues that kind of sparkle throughout the image are also, the computer program, abstracting it, and it builds these parts that then I kind of collaged into the final composition.
Hmm.
And then the final thing I'll say just quickly is that what was interesting too about the stable diffusion model is that the way that it was built out of repeating the way that we see, and so building kind of components from the visual system that then reverse the process of seeing to go from nothing to an image with
Right.
text guidance.
And it sets up dimension and depth and these kinds of things. I mean, even a little bit of atmospheric perspective, it looks like.
Hey,
I mean,
Jason.
it was fun for me. I was seeing when I saw this the first time, like, whoa, that kicks ass. What is it? And I pride myself on being pretty good at, um, finding the sources. Matvey Levenstein says I'm a digger. To find the kind of sources for these things, but I was befuddled, and of course that's the point, right? Because you're not trying to make it very direct, although, with these slides, it's obviously you're looking at kind of things that are related to it. Not everyone should know, not these specific pictures like this incredible Bronzino in Santa Croce, or the great Rubens Valperga altarpiece, which is now in the cathedral in Antwerp, but this sort of general concept of the Baroque, which is like, it's like a Transformers film. It's like a Hollywood blockbuster that's supposed to sort of draw you in, what you're doing in these pictures. What was the name of the program that you were using? The
Stable diffusion.
Stable Diffusion. That was the AI program.
Yeah.
Hey, Jason. Apologies for the interruption.
Yeah.
The slides seem to be glitching a little bit on our end. Would it be possible for you to stop the share and then
Yeah.
reshare
Sorry about that.
just to see if it resolves the issue? Thank you.
Yeah. I don't know what's going on.
They're just dancing a bit.
Yeah. How's that?
Seems to be better.
Okay.
Thank
Sorry
you.
about that.
No, sorry.
Um, and then, like we're talking about the idea that from a distance it resolves quite well, but then as you're pulled in, you can see what's happening on the surface. And there's a little bit of impasto in these, I seem to remember, not a lot, but the fact that you're sort of limiting yourself to the four colors, the CMYK colors, that's it, and then trying to produce material out of that as the printer would. And that's really interesting. We'll talk a little bit later about neo-impressionism and the idea of the mechanization. And also, this is something you're still using in your pictures today. But what I think will be interesting also to people is that, the paintings at this show at Nino Mier, which was called Error Signals from 2023, were not all these kinds of bombastic works. There were also works like this, which was hung kind of like a triptych, right? Studio window one, two, and three, 86 by 66 inches each. And this is the studio window, the only window, right, in your studio up in New Haven. They used to have in New Haven, which has a beautiful sense of sort of quietude, and something which relates to views of windows and in romantic art. The Metropolitan Museum of Art long ago did a whole show about the open window in romantic art, and I think of paintings by Menzel and other artists from the 19th century, and with like subtle changes. But these are all, again, large scale works, and they also have a similar kind of treatment of surface, which becomes even more kind of pulse pounding, without all the bombastic miles and miles of flesh in the Ziggy Stardust film. So, maybe just talk for a second about the the diversity maybe between these two approaches. And in the end, the subject becomes a bit irrelevant, right?
Yeah, I mean the window paintings, as you said, they're the window of my studio, and they're essentially one-to-one scale. And so when they're hung in a gallery space, then
Hmm.
architecturally there's kind of a rhyme between the gallery space, and then it sets up the relationship between a parallel to the studio space. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is using these sort of digital immaterial images, and even the Baroque, there's this kind of repeated a notion that we've lost the connection to the ability to make pictures like this, or that comes throughout the Renaissance.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's almost like a loss of materiality, and or a material understanding rather. And so a lot of what is interesting to me about these paintings and the structure of them is that when you get close to them, the sort of just literal brush marks are visible, and the image itself drops out, and so it's reduced to just these kind of material gestures. And so the studio window, the window, as you said, in painting has been a theme from the Greeks, and this kind of notion of the painting as a window that you
Hmm.
project yourself into. Um, and that comes back when, in film theory, that the idea of
Uh-oh. We're glitchy today. I don't know why. Asher, we've lost you. You're frozen. Hanging on the film theory concept. Um, so well, we wait for Asher to reset. I don't know, Joshua, can you still hear me?
Yeah, we can still hear you. Um,
No.
Give us one moment while we try to get Asher back in
Yeah,
here.
yeah. So, I mean, what people can see is that, this is moving towards a kind of conceptual idea about picture making, working with the picture plane, working with the grid, working with ideas of kind of formal rigor and design, reflecting the nature of the support, which is portrait format, taller vertical and shorter on the ends and the top and the bottom, and thinking about these kinds of things at the same time that he's modulating the light and tone and other elements in the representation to make it into a alluring sort of picture. Um, and I think, the kinds of things that you see Asher doing in this picture are reflected when he comes back. You can talk about this painting from the next year, Wipe 2024, which is kind of related to what he's talking about, this idea of the screen and the concept of the screen, and whether it's a movie screen or a TV screen or what have you, and thinking about it in this way. He's back on the
Sorry about
phone.
that. Of course, the first time my studio Wi-Fi not yonks out, it's
Yep.
during the talk.
Yeah, there's something in the air today. This is us dealing with the perma winter in New York. It's just constantly like this. So
Yeah.
I don't know if you heard anything I was saying, but we were talking about the idea of the screen and talking about the idea of film theory, and then a picture like this, I think, is really illustrates what you're thinking about. The idea of its, the I don't know, the ephemerality of the representation or the image.
Yeah, I mean the interest in the curtained window to me was that it's this window that you can't project yourself out of. The curtain keeps the image on the surface of it, and so
Yeah,
rather than having a space that you go out into, you're left with this sort of flat thing that keeps you in the space in the same way that it creates this parallel to the studio. And then, of course, the romance of the image is broken by the fluorescent lights that also break the grid of the image.
right.
In this painting, this is the windshield wiper is quite literally wiping away the paint on the surface of the image, and this will come back, I guess, in the current show, but this idea of rhyming the idea of rhyming the subject matter in the image with the actual material structure of the way it's painted has always been of interest to me.
Yeah.
Uh, and so in this painting, the wiper becomes like a mechanism to unite the two.
Yeah. And I want people to notice, if you look closely at whatever you're watching this on, that there are a lot of drips here. So while it may seem as if you are trying to almost mechanically apply these colored dots to make the forms and scenes and tones, etc., you're also allowing for the accident, right?
Yeah, when I was talking, I showed someone a photo of my paintings once, and they made a comparison to when a drop of water falls on your phone screen, and all of the colors kind of get broken up like a prism.
Yeah.
And this idea that if you dropped your phone in a puddle or something, this idea that when something breaks, you actually sort of see how it's made is really interesting to me. And the drips, come into the work later because at the beginning when I was making these paintings, I would work against them and make sure and prevent them from occurring. And then a few of them got by me, and then I realized that that was kind of the most interesting part of the paintings became the drips because it shows them the image breaking, and it reminds you that it's a painted thing even when you're further back and the image resolves, you still have the sense of surface and sense of liquid paint, um and so it keeps it grounded in the this object of a
Mhm.
paint.
And then if you think about that whole idea with respect to the most sort of straightforward art historical comparative, which is Seurat and Pointillism, Neo-Impressionism, especially the incredible late works that he does at Omfle with these landscapes, seascapes. Some are a little industrial. This is from 1886 on the right. I mean, the view on the left in white is like that innocuous New Jersey Turnpike in Elizabeth kind of view that you get of sort of industrial wasteland that the cars just go through at 65 miles an hour. But there's always a kind of motion, I think, in your pictures, and Seurat's absolutely against that. Everything is frozen, solid, Egyptian in style, he used to call it, Seurat. But that idea of Seurat at night in his studio painting in the dark with candlelight in order to push himself to get as bright a coloration as possible so that the dots would meld in the viewer's eye when you're looking at the picture. Of course, you're calling attention to the formulation of the image of the image in doing the process that you're working with.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, two things. I think one, I'm always working from a photographic source, and a
Sure.
photographic source is so static that that breathing some life via movement or via the actual materiality and loosening up the reins a bit is of interest to me.
Yeah.
Whereas, in Seurat, that he's not working from a photographic source most likely, um, and so I guess the static quality of them. I mean, I adore the static quality of them and the kind of rigid surface that it creates. Um, but what's interesting about them too is that there's this idea that the color in them is always there's orange and blue reds in a surface that's green, and it's the way that your eye mixes them
Yeah.
that creates the final effect. But actually, if you look up close to them, then most of the areas in a green tree are green, and so there's kind of there's some cheating that goes on.
Yeah,
Uh,
for sure.
but but yeah, I think that that I do like the sense of locked inness that his paintings tend to have, and a lot, and I think some of my when I'm working, that's something I look for too. But then, but then I think with the drips, that is that movement, but it's an unintentional effect. So it's not something I'm doing. I'm not working towards that movement. It just happens to be happening to the surface.
But it also does, like you were saying about the drop of water on the iPhone, it does reveal the pure color, right? That in the
Yeah.
end, you're working from the pure color, which in the overall scheme, gets subsumed to the representation.
Yes.
In the show at Nino Mier in 2023, as I mentioned, there were drawings in the back and just a couple of things that seemed to me a kind of precursor to what you're working with in the exhibit now in Tribeca. So here are two very beautiful drawings, tulips on the left, and on the right, poke. And what I alluded to before in the works from 2019, your student day, is this kind of manipulation of the image and warping it and doing things to it. And then on the right, making it into a kind of meta discourse with the inclusion of the hand. So maybe talk a little bit, and also just to point out, we're dealing less here in these drawings with the use of the dot or the point like you see in the acrylic ink paintings we just showed you, but more because they're colored pencil, right? It's about a kind of drawn line. So these were just kind of one-off things that got you thinking about new approaches.
Yeah, I started doing these drawings in preparation for this show, and they're made with colored pencil. And if you've ever tried to make a tiny dot with a colored pencil, it's not very easy. It's not kind of a process inherent to the medium. And so, rather than break a line up with dots, as in the paintings with ink, the pencil, it becomes easier to use pressure. And so, you can sort of see in the detail of the image, but it's the same color system, so cyan, magenta, yellow, black. But rather than breaking up the line with the dots, it's pressure, and so the line is kind of consistent down the image, and it creates these, essentially four overlaid grids that, as the pressure changes, the color changes. And what was really interesting to me when I first started to do it was an accidental quality that they start to feel like textiles. That once you kind of interweave these grids on top of one another, then the final result starts to feel like a woven surface rather than a painted surface or a drawn surface. And what was interesting to me about that was A, that I wasn't trying to, and that it was a result of working from a digital process, and B, the fact that the Jacquard loom was a predecessor for the computer. And so this was the kind of coding, the way that you'd code, so to speak, a textile became the or very early methods for creating computer programs. And so it's almost like this full circle thing where the DNA was still in there. And so on the left-hand side, there are these kind of knitting needles that are, both either undoing or doing the image. And again, each color is kind of pulled out in a thread, and so you can start to see how the image itself is rendered. And on the right-hand side, there's a digital print of my finger that is manipulating the hand-drawn image. And, a poke is sort of the phrase of poking fun or poking holes, and it's this kind of playful and kind of dumb gesture, but that has a very kind of immediate visual effect. And for me, the interest was the way that I could have this really kind of literal, simple interaction that was a hand-drawn image and a digital image that was printed mechanically. And so making those two things meet and interact in a physical way was interesting to me.
And these you made 3 years ago, though, but you were thinking about the project that we're going to talk about in a minute, right? That's interesting that these are kind of in their mindset. And
Yeah.
people should also notice a couple things which you won't see in the new set, which is the signature at the bottom here in graphite. But also the needles, which you're pointing out here, which I didn't notice before, that they're the needles that, as if showing you the tool-based element. But also, I'm thinking about the idea of drawings, especially since that Michelangelo foot sold for $27 million at Christie's the other day, postage stamp sized drawing. But the idea of cross hatching, right? So weft and wove, which relates to weaving, looms, but also cross hatching, which is in the history of drawing, long before looms, the way that artists were able to use graphite, pencil, chalk, whatever, to make transitions of light to dark, chiaroscuro in drawings. But the magical thing of what I think Asher does is that he's using these four colors in order to not just make shading and modeling, but to make the entire thing and maintain the weaving, the grid that you're using here, pretty special, I think. Colored pencils? It's it's the kind of thing you grow up with, right? You're doing spirographs or you're doing just drawings and having fun, and then translating it here into this sort of level of veracity, which is fascinating to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think also if you to go back to Seurat for a second, I mean,
Yeah.
one of like I think his drawings are just as great
Yeah.
as his paintings,
Incredible.
and the whole the great idea he had with those drawings is using the texture of this French paper where you can use a soft pencil to essentially just bring the texture of the paper as the mark making device in a way that creates
No
this
lines.
like a matrix that yeah, and so there's a quality that I loved about those that I was kind of wanted to reach for when figuring out the modeling of these.
Yeah. And then this drawing from the next year, where it feels like you're applying the cognitive science and the idea of dissembling what you've created. So it's one thing to show how it's created with the needles, then poke it and sort of manipulate the image and warp it in its weft and its wove. And then here, actually seeing it, unraveling with this perfectly Baroque image of a candle that relates to vanitas and memento mori and the brevity of life, and then it's decomposing at the bottom.
Yeah, so this is again the when the image breaks, it shows you how it's made, and kind of like the wipe, painting, like you were saying, the vanitas imagery is sort of the information of the image, and then the material of the image is rhyming with that in that it's fraying, and that this thing that is the rectangle is lost its sort of stability.
Mhm.
And so it's rhyming those two things, and making you feel kind of the delicacy of and the vulnerability of the drawing itself, not just through kind of association with the image, but through feeling a kind of tactile sense of that.
And then the tactility and then the challenge of doing something which is of course ephemeral, right? And this is again an image that you sourced or just from
No,
anywhere.
I mean, soon after the show that you saw,
Yeah.
I moved I mean, I guess about that during that show too, I used only my own imagery. So these are all
Okay.
photographs I've taken. I mean, I count the those digitally
Yep.
collaged AI things as also built imagery. But so rather than appropriating and kind of using this pop vocabulary, I wanted to take these, cold digital processes, and have them actually be kind of regurgitating observations from my own life and people I have close relationships with, and then come back out on the other side.
Yeah. And the candle is, excuse the pun, hot in art. Obviously, Gerhard Richter made it a subject, but also, I don't know if, did you see Phoebe Hellender's show, Paintings from the Orange
Yeah,
Room?
I love those
PPOW.
amazing.
At PPOW at the end of last year's incredible suite of pictures of candles.
Yeah,
Very moving. Okay, so here we are, Cat's Cradle.
here
So
we are.
Cat's Cradle is set up in the gallery with this view of across the room of a set of, on either side, 20 images, 4 by 5 grid. The original drawing signed and dated on the back, no longer on the front, colored pencil and giclée print on paper, and facing each other. Why don't you tell people what the concept is, and then the execution we'll look at.
So yeah, so like you said, I mean, I'll start with just the literal process of them. There are
Mm.
these images of my hands that are digitally printed on the paper first, and then the colored pencil is done over those to create the illusion that the hands are taking apart or weaving or manipulating the fabric of the drawing. Um, and then those images are re-photographed or scanned, and then we work through with these printmakers to create the facsimile versions of them, which are then hung in the same 4 by 5 grid on the opposite side of the gallery. And on inspection, it's very difficult to discern between the two. And so, I mean, like you said, there's like with the Richter and the candle, or the Baroque in the larger painting, the still life became a target for these because the still life represents this very simplified interaction between an observer, the artist looking at this kind of object and wanting to create a representation of it. And it becomes kind of the foil for Cubism and trompe l'oeil and Dutch still lifes, and the Dutch did them so beautifully, and they at the same time that they invented the microscope. And this idea of looking has always been sort of, I think, in the most central quality of the still life, which is why I'm so interested in it. And so I built these still lifes in the studio. I got a bunch of objects together, created this structure, the hands, the doubling, and I had sort of the conceptual framework for the artwork worked out first, and then that allows me to kind of to go back and to be kind of heavy-handedly make these references to still lifes that I love, but then the kind of the deconstruction of those things ends in and the playfulness of the repetition becomes part of the work itself. So, I'm repeating a motif from art history that then I'm drawing that, I'm repeating it by making it in the studio, and then I'm photographing it, which is a different sense of repetition. And then I'm drawing the colored pencil from the photographs, which is another layer of repetition, where I am repeating the mechanical image, and the mechanical image repeats me by this final again layer of printing. And so there's all these cycles that this piece for me was a way of creating this playful set of cycles that are constantly kind of coming together and coming apart in the same way that the fabrics are. And
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, I like that idea that it's like cyclical, really, coming together and coming apart, and then replicated, and then on and on and on. Um, and the idea is that one side is the handmade originals in a sense, and the other side is the reproduction. And if you so fortunate as to buy one of the 20, you would get what?
So when they leave the show, then each of the original 20 is paired with 19 facsimiles, so they're essentially 20 new grids. And so it's kind of the game is then whether there's this difference between the handmade thing and the mechanically reproduced thing.
So you get the one original and then 19 of the rest,
Yeah.
which you get in some kind of a nice box, I presume. And
Well,
then you buy
we
that
make
how?
we make everyone get them framed because
Okay.
otherwise everyone would only show the original. But
Ah,
for
I
me, it's
see.
really there are threads that kind of literally connect across the borders of the frames. But the but also once they're all together, the hands start to almost become this abstract like musical note quality where they create almost like a breeze or a rhythm throughout the image.
Yeah.
That is very important to the artwork itself.
Now, I mean, do you, like, when Warhol did his soup cans, right? The first set for Irving Blum in Los Angeles, 1962, he arranged them along a shelf in the gallery in LA as if they were products on a shelf. But when you see them now at MoMA, if they ever have them up, they will put them in a grid. And of course, the grid is not dictated which flavor of soup goes where. Everyone has their favorite. But is this orientation the way that you would need to see them? Now, let me just point out, you already mentioned that, but that some of them do connect top to bottom. Let's get to that at the end because I have other stuff I want to
Okay.
look at. But is this 4x5 with these specific works in the orientation that you would prefer?
Yes.
Okay. So it's kind of locked. And I just
Yes.
want to show people, maybe so you can illustrate that, the bottom row here from left to right, and it ends with the kind of pseudo empty hands where you start on the left and you have this image of the fruit in a bowl, reflection, the knife, and then a section of it being removed. And then the one next to it with the image of the lemon where it's being distorted through the pulling of the strings. And then this one, presumably the photo includes the knife with your hands,
Correct.
right? And then you drew the stuff on it, the bits on it. Okay. And then this unspooling rind of the lemon, which is such a motif obviously in Dutch 17th century painting, Flemish and Dutch 17th century painting, a symbol of the transience of life and efflorescence of existence, and then how it becomes denigrated. And there's usually knives in these paintings, like this one by Dechim, and sometimes butterflies. There was an incredible Rachel Roish exhibition at the MFA in Boston last year. I think it was one of the shows of the year, showing you her still life paintings and where she sourced material from all over the world. Your choice of material is much more focused stuff you found in Brooklyn and then had in your apartment, in your studio. But then each one sort of complicates the intellectual engagement with the concept that you so nicely already outlined. And then the one on the right, bottom right here, with just the two hands and this one blue string, which, as I'll show you guys in a bit, connects with the image right above it. So it
Yeah.
is kind of sort of locked a bit in space. And the hands are like a kind of orchestration, almost like a conductor that flows through. So let me show you a little art history, hands in space. Maybe thinking about this, Fra Angelico, one of the craziest images of the 15th century. I did not see the Fra Angelico show in Italy, sadly, which recently closed. But this painting from, I think, Monk cell number 7, for those of you who are counting, at San Marco in Florence, with this image of the mocking of Christ, with this sort of, everyone always says proto-surreal representations of these disembodied hands, right, in space. Is this something that connected with you at an early age? This painting?
Not that particular
Yeah.
painting, but when I was younger and I was still, figuring out, trying to still thinking I could paint like a Caravaggio painting.
Yeah.
There are amazing. I painted like a crop in on basically just the hands of all these saints that are creating this wonderful movement, and the hands are such a, are such a one of often the only place where movement is really introduced into these very kind of early static images. And so I was always interested in that. And I loved the Dürer hand studies that come a little later.
Picabia too. Picabia
Yeah.
did weird hand studies also.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a motif. And then, that image at the bottom right corner, of course, recalls Michelangelo's the detail here of the creation of Adam from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Although the idea of the spark of life coming from God's hand, which is reaching out on the right, and then the limp hand of Adam that's awaiting his humanity essentially, and then just that gap between them. And I love the kind of focused energy of the hands that your own hands photographed there on the left with that string pulled taut. But is it creating or undoing? That's a question, right? In this image on the left.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the idea of the idea of bringing this kind of the play that happens in the studio into the final work is
Hmm.
and the idea of creating, and obviously when you're working on a drawing, you're not just pulling on the paper, but there's kind of a visual pun between the two, uh, and so my hands are quite literally in the work, as they are making the images.
Yeah.
And although obviously the hands are mechanically produced rather than handmade, and so maybe it's not not as lofty as God and man, but maybe
Yeah.
it's just kind of the digital and the handmade kind of battling it out.
Yeah. But the hand of the artist is such a, it's like a trope in a way. And it's something
Yeah,
that
yeah,
the whole point of why we make our students, even if they're art history students, take drawing one is because there's that intimacy between the brain through the arm and into the hand and then making a mark. They have to
yeah.
understand that, right? As something electric. And here you're doing it on so many different levels because the manipulation of the string, the faux string, right? And then the fact that you're actually drawing the string itself, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that like the idea of negation is really interesting to me, and I mean, I think and the idea of starting with these, art historically grounded references, but then having them, the kind of undoing of them is the kind of a through line through the work, and then the final thing of mechanically copying the handmade drawing, like you were saying, drawing is sort of the most sacred, um, you know, connection between the artist and the viewer. It's like the viewer can like the hand is sort of more free than in a painting. It's almost like it's less like a drawing is less prepared to go out into the world or something. It's more intimate than a painting, and so it's kind of there's a greater sense of immediacy traditionally.
Mm.
And so then kind of mechanically copying that is almost a sacrilegious kind of, of undoing of that immediacy. And and so that which was very exciting to me.
Yeah. I love this one too, because the hands seem to be operating at cross purposes. It's as if they're from two different bodies, right? The one is doing that gesture, which is also from religious painting, St. John the Baptist pointing up, references to Jesus as the one true God. And then on the left, you have your left hand pulling some imaginary string, to quote Taylor Swift, from up above. This sort of, you don't know where that leads until we see obviously the whole grid, and then the way that the manipulation and the distortion of the swatch of still life, whatever you want to call it, at the point where you have the hardest material, right? This metal bowl using here. So many permutations that you can work with, as well as like the edge of the faux weave, right? Where it almost looks like off register colors, right? That kind of thing, as if it's being printed, which of course it is.
Yeah, yeah. I mean the when it's printed, it's quite literally, using the same pencil colors to recreate the image. And like you were saying, yeah, the fraying shows shows you, I think, in a more simple way how the drawing itself is made. Um,
Mm.
but I also in this image, like you were saying, the hardness of the edge of that bowl that then gets, just subtly warped by the poke. Um, Creates like a feeling that is very tactile,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that I enjoyed.
Molten almost.
Yeah.
And I love this one. It's just this is the most meta one in a way. Um, the, so the process here is a little different, Asher.
Yeah, so the process for this one required first drawing this with no hands on the image, just the kind of rectangular image of the lemon and the glass, which
Hmm.
itself is kind of a nod to this Liechtenstein lemon glass still
Yeah,
life. And so I drew that and then held up a glass in front of the image and then photographed the hand with the glass and to capture all of these kind of distortions that as the light moves through the glass, it pulls apart all of the threads of the image, and uh, and so then that image gets printed on a new piece of paper, and then I redraw the image around it so that in the top it's easiest to see in the top edge of the glass, but above the water line you can see the original image that's being
yeah,
that was printed. And then the rest of the image, so that's a kind of drawn image mimicking a hand drawn image next to over the border the repeated hand drawn image, so that there's kind of like the procedural steps are inversed a bit.
right. I mean, the tediousness or well, not tedious, maybe just the kind of focus involved in making this, I think is pretty astounding. But it's also feels kind of fun though, you know? I mean, just you working it out mentally, how this is going to play, and then setting it up in the studio. Or you're shooting it yourself, or you have someone shooting it for you
Yeah, I mean,
before?
over a long period of time, I set up these still lives, and it was tricky because I didn't want them to feel too staged,
Yeah,
and so I set up a lot of kind of situations, and then would walk around and do other things, and then stumble, look back at it and see a arrangement that and just shot it, and so I took thousands of photos
yeah,
over a period of time, um and yeah, and so the photographs are some of the lemons have their stickers on them. They're kind of they're more literal
right. I
rather
see
than
it. I saw that.
romantic.
Yeah,
Um,
the lemons have meaning the stickers from that you see in the
yeah,
supermarket.
yeah,
Still have
yeah,
more
and I mean,
love
and
there.
like we were saying with the idea of play, and I was talking to this composer George Lewis who has done a lot of work on improvisation, and we were talking about my paintings, which are there's slippage and accidents, but there's not much improvisation while I'm actually working. And he kind of corrected me and said that the improvisation is all in the planning stage, which I had never thought about quite in those terms.
Yeah.
But in this piece especially, there's a lot of play and improvisation and movement that's involved in and change that's involved in the planning stages versus a piece like this. I had to kind of set up the parts in advance, so that I then
Mm.
once I started making it, I was like maybe that's the more tedious part of it,
Yeah.
or the executing part
Execution.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the kind of creative spirit and the freedom and play that is, I think, still in for me, that is in the final kind of coming together of the whole thing,
Right.
is in that earlier planning stage.
Yeah. I think this is the one I didn't know him, but that would make Saul Steinberg smile the most, I think. This kind of image and that sense of
So,
manipulation of form and play. Um, we're almost done, Joshua. A couple more images and then we'll move to questions. So be preparing your questions, but I wanted to throw a couple things at you, Asher, just to get your response. This is my favorite watercolor ever. And looking at your the present series, it made me think of this. Cezanne, Still Life with Green Melon. I think it's in a private collection. Lucky people who have it. I'm not a huge Cezanne fan, sorry, crowd. But this work, I don't know, have you ever seen this one?
never in person, but I saw a bunch of the other ones, watercolors at was it the MoMA? Was it MoMA that
Yeah,
they did that
yeah,
drawing
yeah.
show? Yeah, a few years
Right.
ago.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
So
that's magnificent.
incredible, right? It's sort of sense of resolution and dissolution at the same time. Nobody ever did it better than that. And of course, he's working really with the same color scheme that you're working with in making your works, the CMYK, maybe not dark blue instead of black, right? But he's forming it out of that, but in an aqueous way, not with
I mean,
lines or
and I
dots.
think that, like we were saying earlier about hatching as sort of just like this foundational, semantic tool in art history is,
Yeah,
um, he used all the time, and the idea of building this image through parts, is something that I've always really been fascinated with, and so the rhyme of the grids overlaying one another and the drawings, and then the hatching in an image like this. Um, comes from a similar, place, although he's using them very differently.
yeah, different material and technique. And
Yeah.
here's my favorite watercolor at Yale, which you might know. Great Charles Demuth, precisionist painter from Philadelphia, from Pennsylvania. Green Pears, which I just love this thing. I don't know. And it looks like very straightforward, but it is not straightforward. I mean, that's the joy that I get from your work also. Don't you look at it from a distance, things change the more you look, the closer you get, but also like these shadowy elements and the way he deals with color and modeling. Demuth is still underappreciated, I think, as an artist.
Yeah, he's one of the great watercolor masters.
Yeah,
Yeah,
incredible.
it's beautiful.
Um, so I promised to talk about that idea of interconnectedness. And here, this I was teaching this the other day in my Survey 2 class, and the way that Giotto in the Arena Chapel or Scrovegni Chapel in Padua was doing this, comic book-like organization of narratival scenes to tell the story of the Virgin Mary at the top, and then the bottom two of the teaching and the Passion of Christ. But we were talking about it with my students, the way that he, at the same time that he has discrete images in their sort of rectangular boxes, he's unifying the compositions through the backgrounds. This line, this sort of stone wall in the image of the Lamentation, which carries on up through the mountain in the raising of Lazarus. Or it goes up here and then it comes back down the background in the image of the Noli Me Tangere, where Christ is resurrected in fright of Mary Magdalene. So Giotto sort of bleeding through these images, and this is a similar thing to how Asher is using the interconnectedness of the thread, just because you can see the way that he's hung these in a grid, that the pictures, come together. These are not side by side, but they are, related. And that's something that you obviously planned out long before.
Yeah, I mean, I've always loved in the Scrivini Chapel. The most amazing thing to me was on the top, frame when the figures kneel and then they stand, they standing, they kneel, and then they stand again. It's sort of like the first film sequence in art history.
Yeah. Yeah.
It could have been stills on a film strip. But this idea that these small changes, when placed next to one another, create a sense of kind of iteration and movement. Um,
Mm.
that's definitely of interest to me, and especially in the hands, and sort of how the hands are placed throughout the image. I didn't want them I wanted that sort of organic, movement throughout the image to be strengthened by kind of the images next to one another. And like you were saying, the lemon sequence on the bottom, there's a lemon that is kind of cut out from the frame, the other grouping by the hands, and then it
There it
comes
is.
back and then the next image is the
Here.
single lemon, and the next image after that is
Yeah.
the same lemon that's been spiraled by the knife, which has been pulled out into the digital, and then in the next frame, the lemon goes back into the still lifes,
Yeah.
with the teacup, and then the next frame, it's everything is gone. It gets sent back up, and the teacup and the lemon are whole again. And so there's
It's up here.
yeah, and so there are a few kind of, without I didn't want there to be kind of a narrative throughout it. I mean, I think still life is the
Right.
most anti-narrative genre perhaps,
Yeah.
but
Referential, but not narratival. Yeah.
yeah, and the hands connect the grid, but I wanted there to be these kind of undercurrents throughout that would also connect the individual frames with one another.
Yeah.
And so that lemon sequence becomes one of those. Or on the top left, there's my hand pulling the apple, and then that goes down, and the apples are now in a tower that balanced on a thumb, and below that, that image, the apple is pulled out by a hand as the image is pulled in half by the other hands, um and so that there are kind of these games that connect them, to create a sense of sort of shared
Mm.
uh frame, or film, almost film comic, like film strip, whatever you want to
Yeah.
go with.
Yeah.
But yeah, this chapel, I mean, the images in the Giotto chapel have always been fascinating.
The greatest.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pause there for a second.
Okay.
Asher, thank you so much for sharing so many insights about your nascent career and the present works, which I encourage everyone to go see. We'll come back in a little bit after the questions and just wrap up. But let me turn it over to Joshua for the moment, and let's see what people have for us.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason and Asher, for that conversation. We're going to jump right into questions here. Our first question today is going to come from Fong. So I'm going to let you unmute here.
Cool. Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, Asha. Wonderful. NSE, definitely. And Jason always able to bring in art historic context references from left to right, like a baseball player. It's impressive. Thank you. And I did see the show, and I heard throughout your conversation, and I was thinking this because Jason had brought up 1962, Warhol first Campbell soup, which didn't really become more intensify in his idea of seriality until more or less, I would say 67, or that very significant year. Why? Because when Charlie calls both art forum from John Irwin Jr., because it's based in San Francisco, as he indicated, Ferris Gallery, where it began there. He brought it to New York, and the first issue of New York feature brilliantly, because we have a guest critic who pays so much homage to the great Michael Free in this issue.
Hmm.
So Michael Free, great landmark essays called Art and Objecthood. Together with Robert Morris, it's called Some Notes on Sculpture, as well as solo with paragraphs on conceptual art. Huge issue, landmark issue. What is my question? It's very simple. I wonder, thinking about the alphabet painting of Philip Gurston, who one of the few member of the New York School, like the rest of them, were threatened by conceptual art and minimalism. I know that he didn't like it, but he began to strip down everything he had amassed after the Jewish Museum show, which is 66, I believe, 67, 68, leading his first infamous show at the Marlborough Gallery in 1980, which basically derailed his entire career. We now admire so much. But what is my question again? I tend to have long-winded questions. Sorry. The question is, have you read that solo word paragraph of conceptual art carefully? Because, he shifted the focus from visual expression to intellectual concept of cognitive study, perception, and system theory and whatnot. And I wonder, since Gurston's pared down every single mark making from 1, 2, 3, 4 to separate alphabet almost, it's exactly reflected Barbara Rose landmark essay, ABC art. You remember? Oh, so why don't I ask you that too? So between Barbara ABC art essay and solo with paragraphs on conceptual art. So I wonder, you read it carefully, and if so, how did it affect your thinking about seriality? Of course, grid system and whatnot, everything that goes between with your hand gestures.
I have not read the Barbara Rose essay, which I need to read. But I have read the Solowit essay, and I mean it's interesting to put Solowit and Guston next to each other because I mean I haven't read the Barbara Rose, but Solowit, a lot of the ideas of conceptual art or this that the making and execution are sort of differentiated from one another, whereas the Guston famously would scratch out and struggle and smoke and chain smoke and drink and do all of that in front of the canvases as he kind of moved back and forth working out the composition. I mean, certainly a lot of the grid structure that Solowit uses so effectively is very important to me. It creates the sense of iteration and repetition that you almost get in like a game of telephone as well, where as something is repeated, it changes, which has always been interested to me. And also when similar to the window paintings earlier, but more so in a grid, that when you put things in a grid like this, the small differences between them start to feel very different than when you're looking at, or start to be heightened rather than when you're looking at them kind of individually. And also what Solowit so effectively kind of lays out is a creative structure that almost, in a very different way can be seen as like Eno's weak strategies or these kind of almostly insignificant seeming rules and techniques that can open up this world of kind of creative possibility. And so in the framework for this show, there are these rules and sort of, they're guide rails that are built into the system.
Yeah.
But then working in those creates all these opportunities. So, for example, the way that the hands are playing with the images, thinking of those was a very iterative process, and they unfold from the structures that are laid out before the piece is made. And so they're almost more responsive than created out of the void. And also, obviously, Solowit used kind of these overlay. Some of my favorite pieces of his come from the chance interactions between overlaid, horizontal lines and vertical lines, or different oscillating circles, and then the interaction of all those layers creates this stunning visual effect that is so much more complex than the simple procedures that he went through to make it.
Mm-hmm.
But that contrast has always been fantastically effective for me in terms of thinking about the process of making something, and so that I hope I somehow in there perhaps.
No,
Yes, and you use the same colored pencils, right? Solid wood. I mean, you use the same the same color scheme, colored pencils. My favorite line from that essay is, "New materials are one of the great afflictions of contemporary art. Some artists confuse new materials with new ideas."
Yeah,
So I
yeah,
think you would have appreciated your brand of conceptual art in that sense also.
no,
yeah,
but
and yeah.
it's also interesting to put Lewitt and Warhol in the
Mm,
same thinking, because they both aspire to have machine that makes art. We know that. It's
mhm.
famous. They both claim so very similarly, declaratively. I once have a discussion with Dave Hickey about this. I mean, he basically argued without Warhol, the concept of how the aesthetic of supermarket in the different aisles would not appear the same way as it has since Warhol then. But it's a matter it's interesting in thinking about the Warhol retrospective. This is go for everybody here, you guys and our friends in the audience, was that when the big show of MoMA Warhol, I think it's 93, when John Updike reviewed it for the Atlantic magazine, he called his review, if I can be wrong, but I think it's called, uh, you know, uh, quick art for busy Manhattan night, fast art for busy Manhattan night, implying Warhol silkscreen painting is not worth inspecting with greater slow meditation, which is true. You can say that. But and then when I asked him a week later, I ran in the street. I say, "Have you seen his film, sir? I appreciate your review, but you seem to be dismissed and ready to judge Warhol. But have you seen his film?" And he say, "No." And I say, "Well, they are the opposite of the silk screen, because each of them might run 6 or 7 hours long."
Yeah.
And I really believe without the film, Warhol just being silk screening painting would not be ever thought of a legitimate artist, in my view. So it's a matter of speed, slowness of execution, or slowness of perception. That's something I want to discuss or contemplate thinking about it when I see you. Sorry, you guys. Congratulations, Asher. I gotta go to a meeting, but thank you, Jason.
Fast
Thank you,
art and fast
everyone.
fun.
Ciao.
Thank you so
Ciao.
much, Fong.
Bye.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Fong, for that question, and thank you, Asher, for that thoughtful response. I want to get to one last question here from the audience. This question comes from Oriane in the audience, who's curious, do you think about the process and history, either conceptual or historical, of weaving, since that's something you're referencing, and more specifically, the history of weaving beyond the mention of the jacquard loom?
Yeah, I mean, one of the people I read a lot and to get ideas from, looked at a lot of her work, was Annie Albers. We'll kind of come back at the end, um, but weaving, I mean, what's so amazing about looking at woven art is that, weaving has such a structure, an important structural quality, that then a lot of artists, in making the art, are responding to the already present structure of a woven textile. And and so while I wasn't actually creating, weavings myself physically, it was very generative to look at, um, how they were, how they were, a lot of people play with how they can come apart or building holes in them, and rather than just kind of weaving an image in itself. And it's also a part, I guess it was before starting these drawings a year or two ago, I hadn't looked at these very much. And so it's one of these things where when you look at, it was very kind of world expanding, for me. Um,
I mean, I think the Ruth Asawa show also at MoMA,
yeah, yeah.
that's a kind of weaving with wire, creating
Totally.
negative space, three-dimensional form, that kind of process is so central.
Yeah.
Continued. I'll put the quote up for you, Asher.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I think that with Asawa, what I was about to say too is that you see kind of the parallel art historical paths between weaving and hatching, and
Yeah.
Asawa uses weaving in the sculpture so beautifully, but she also uses hatching in the drawing so beautifully, and creates a really kind of poetic rhyme between those two, the mark making of drawing and the weaving of material physical objects.
And what was so great in that show was how they highlighted the shadows cast by these sculptures on the
Yeah.
ground, which is an homage to, of course, artists who put the canvas on the ground like Pollock. But the idea of the cast shadow turns it into a two-dimensional drawing in shades of gray. Yeah, I'll remember that show for a long time, I have to say, Ruth Asawa. I don't know if it's still up. Maybe it's still going.
Just close. It's just
Oh,
close.
just close. There you go.
Thanks so
So
much,
Asher
Asher.
thought he would end or close with a quote from Annie Albers. So why don't you go ahead and read this in stentorian tones, Asher?
Yeah, so I won't say anything about it, but I'll just leave it as a final note. But the quote is, if we want to get from materials the sense of directness, the adventure of being close to the stuff the world is made of, we have to go back to the material itself, to its original state, and from there on partake in its stages of change. And so I thought a lot about this when I was working on the exhibition.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thanks so much.
Asher Lifton's Cat's Cradle is on view until this Saturday, Valentine's Day, at Nino Mier in Tribeca. And the challenge is go in there and figure out which is the original, the drawing, and then which is the print, which side is which. We're not going to tell you. But Asher, thank you so much for generously giving us of your time today. It was a pleasure talking to you, and the art is both beautiful, I have to say it, and intricate, and also very thought-provoking. And I thank you for it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Jason. I always love the images you bring in, but and then some of those were surprising.
Yep.
But I'm honored to be on the other end of your scope for once.
And everyone should get the new issue of the Brooklyn Rail. There it is, February, hot off the presses. And at the gallery, by the way, there is a beautiful catalog for Cat's Cradle with some photographs of the studio and other stuff and reproductions. This is at scale, right, Asher?
I think very nearly.
Very nearly of
Very
each
nearly.
of the drawings. So
Yeah.
well worth getting. All right,
Yeah.
thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Go ahead, Joshua. Take us out.
Yeah, echoing all of Jason's gratitude. Thank you so much, Asher. And of course, thank you, Jason, for hosting today. We'd also like to thank the Marion Bolton Kippy Stroud Foundation and Tiger Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these weekday conversations possible, and for their support of our growing archive, which you can view on the Rail's YouTube channel. The Rail has been free and independent for 25 years. A donation directly supports our writers, production staff, and operations. Support our work through the link in the chat. And if you're available, join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation with Donna Nelson and Andrew Woolbright on the event of The Individualism of Donna Nelson at Canada. And now, as is Rail tradition, we now invite you to unmute and say hello and goodbye as you leave today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you,
That's
Asher.
great.
Thank you, Jason.
Great to see everybody.
Good job,
Hi,
guys.
Mom. Hi, Dad. That's really nice to
Hey, Asher. Yay, Eric.
Yeah, well
Thank you,
done.
Jason.
Bye.
Hey, Rail
Thank you,
team. Good to
Asher.
see
Hi,
everyone.
Mrs.
Congrats on the
Mrs.
February issue.
Rosenfeld. Hi.
Thank you, everyone.
Hi. And you guys, go see the show. Go see the show, please.
Go see the show. A few days left.
It's a must-see experience, you guys.
That's
Ciao.
Bye,
Congrats,
everybody.
Asher.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.